In a small town in Austria-Hungary in the late 19th century, a man named Victor Lustig was born. And for 57 years, Victor dedicated his entire life to scamming as many people as possible. And although he didn't do it for the fame, he might very well have earned himself the title of the greatest con man of all time. Although I'm sure many of you will be quick to leave a comment letting me know that the greatest con man of all time is actually your least favorite politician. But this particular con man began his troublesome ways at the age of 19, when he would skip his classes at the University of Paris to go gambling. But he did learn some things in school, becoming fluent in Czech, German, English, French, and Italian. I know that sounds impressive, but there was a lot less to do back then, so people learned languages to pass the time. While attending university, Lustig also got a scar on the side of his face after flirting with a jealous man's girlfriend. And as movies will tell you, anyone with a scar on their face instantly becomes evil. So Victor fulfilled that prophecy by going on transatlantic cruise ships between France and New York City. On them, he would convince his fellow travelers to invest in a non-existent Broadway show he was trying to make. A scam which is still around today if you spend enough time in the West Village. But that scam was far too basic for Victor, so he developed a much more creative one. First, he would make friends with the rich passengers on the ship by acting like one of them and flaunting his wealth. Back then, flaunting your wealth just meant being in possession of a $5 bill. Eventually, the people would ask how Victor made his fortune, at which point he would let them in on a little secret known as the Romanian box. The Romanian box was a trunk that Victor would lug around with him, which he claimed could clone money. You simply had to slip a bill into a built-in slot, pull some switches on the side of the box, wait 6 hours, and then pull out an identical bill from a different slot. Victor would show the box to people, demonstrating how it worked by duplicating a $100 bill. And by duplicating, I just mean pulling out another $100 bill that he had stashed in the box hours earlier. I'm not sure why he added the part about it taking 6 hours, but maybe he just liked to have someone to talk to. If the person he showed this to was amazed enough, he would offer to sell them the box. I don't know why they believed that someone who could print infinite money would have the need to sell anything, let alone the thing that was giving them infinite money, but we all know that people who go on cruises are not the brightest members of the population. So Victor would sell the Romanian box for thousands of dollars, loading it with a few $100 bills so it took the person longer to find out it wasn't real, and would then flee into the night upon arriving at the ship's destination. During this time, he became known as the Count, matching the title of the European nobleman that he pretended to be. And you have to remember that nicknames were much cornier back then, so the Count was about as cool as it was gonna get, especially since someone had already beaten him to the nickname Scarface. In 1914, World War I began, meaning people had less time to go on transatlantic cruises. And since everyone in Europe was so busy being killed, Victor moved to the United States. In 1922, he actually managed to scam a bank. Going by the name Robert Duvall, Lustig offered a Missouri bank $22,000 in Liberty bonds in exchange for $10,000 cash. But when the money was put into 2 identical envelopes, Victor switched them out with fake ones and took both the bonds and the cash out of the bank with him. The authorities tracked him to Kansas City and arrested him, but Victor somehow used his charm to convince them not to indict him. So by the age of 32, Victor Lustig had already managed to con several cruise ship passengers, steal money from a bank, and even talk his way out of a prison sentence. And he was only a few decades away from winning an Oscar for his role in the film Tender Mercies. For most con men, this would have been a fulfilling career, but those were rookie numbers for Victor, so he moved back to France for his greatest scam yet. By 1925, the Eiffel Tower had fallen into a state of disrepair, with nobody in the city really knowing what to do with it. Paris even began using it as a gigantic ad for the French car company Citroën, and as much as I want to make fun of them for that, it's not hard to imagine the Washington Monument being sponsored by Ford. The Eiffel Tower falling apart gave Victor Lustig an idea, so he forged government documents to make himself appear to be the deputy director of the French Postal Service. Then he gathered a group of scrap metal dealers and told them that the city was preparing to sell the Eiffel Tower for scrap. He claimed that the whole thing was being done in secret, I guess to avoid public backlash from anyone who might be a really big Citroën fan. To make things seem more official, Lustig even rented limousines and gave tours of the tower to the dealers. Luckily for Victor, one of the dealers actually believed that the French government was secretly planning to demolish the Eiffel Tower without telling anyone, and that the whole thing was being handled by an employee of the Postal Service. The dealer who believed it was a man named André Poisson, who was new to Paris and was somehow even more gullible than the city folk who would buy a magic money-cloning box. Lustig took Poisson out to dinner and took the ruse one step further by revealing that not only was he a director of the French Postal Service, he was a corrupt director of the French Postal Service. The implication was that if André Poisson bribed Victor Lustig, then the good count would make sure that Poisson's bid to buy the Eiffel Tower would be selected. Ironically, Lustig asking for a bribe was probably the thing that most made it seem like he really did work for the government. So Poisson gave Lustig a bribe to get his hands on that precious Eiffel Tower scrap metal. The exact size of the bribe is uncertain, but most reports suggest it was $50,000 to $70,000 in today's money. And if that was just the bribe to get the privilege of paying even more for the tower, either me or Andre Poisson is way off about the value of scrap metal. Either way, Victor Lustig fled the city with the bribe and went to Austria to lay low. While he was there, he kept an eye on the newspapers to see if he was wanted for the scam. But Andre Poisson was so humiliated by the con that he couldn't bring himself to go to the police. Perhaps that's why the victims of the Zodiac killer never said anything either. But because Poisson never reported the crime, Lustig decided to take inspiration from the Hangover sequels and do the whole thing again exactly the same way. So he returned to Paris and ran it back. But the Count must not have picked a dumb enough scrap dealer the second time around, because his would-be victim reported him to the police and he was forced to flee the country again. This time he returned to the United States, where he fell back on an old classic and whipped out the Romanian box. And I guess some things never go out of style, because the Romanian box continued to make bank for old Victor. At this point you may be wondering what he did with all the money he made. Or maybe you don't care, but I'll tell you anyway. It turns out that in between all the scamming, Victor Lustig was actually a dedicated family man. In 1919, he married a girl from Kansas named Roberta Norette. The two of them had a daughter, and Lustig spent most of his money on his family. But it turns out that Lustig loved scamming so much that he was even scamming his wife, as he had a mistress that he spent the rest of his money on named Billy May Scheibel. And as much as I want to use a photo of the late spokesman Billy Mays to depict her in this video, I do actually have a picture of her. And Billy May was no ordinary mistress, as she was personally overseeing a $1 million prostitution ring in Pittsburgh. So Victor and Billy May truly were a match made in hell. Anyways, if scamming the bank wasn't enough, Lustig even scammed a Texas sheriff by getting him to buy one of the Romanian boxes. But when the sheriff figured out that it didn't work, he wanted revenge, so he tracked Lustig down to Chicago and confronted him. And still, the Count managed to talk his way out of that one by telling the sheriff that he simply wasn't operating the box correctly. At a certain point, you have to wonder if people were just significantly dumber back then. To further placate the sheriff, Lustig handed him a wad of cash worth several $1,000s. And if that sounds particularly generous for Lustig, you'll be happy to hear that it was yet another scam, as the money was all counterfeit. It seems Victor Lustig had gotten so attached to the idea of the Romanian box that he decided to actually make one. In 1930, he teamed up with a Nebraska chemist named Tom Shaw and a pharmacist named William Watts, beginning an operation which saw them use ink, paper, and plates to create fake bills of all denominations. And through a distribution system that Lustig established, the partners were able to push out $100,000 a month. The operation got to be so big that it attracted the attention of the United States Secret Service. And if you're wondering why the organization that protects the president was looking into money forgery, it's because for some reason the Secret Service only does those two completely unrelated things. The FBI also began an investigation into Lustig, turning him into one of the most wanted men in the country. Normally he would just flee when things got too hot, but family man Victor Lustig was living too cushy of a life in America to leave now. So he spent years on the run from two different departments of the government. One Secret Service agent said Victor was as elusive as a puff of cigarette smoke and as charming as a young girl's dream. And I don't know what that man was doing working for the government, because someone should have given him a book deal. But after all the risky crimes he committed, it was ultimately Victor's horniness that got him in trouble. He began having an affair with the mistress of his business partner Tom Shaw. Apparently these guys were just rolling in mistresses. And while Tom Shaw either didn't know or didn't care, it was Lustig's other mistress Billy May who found out. Furious that the man she was having an affair with was also having an affair with someone else, Billy May placed an anonymous call to the authorities and gave away Lustig's whereabouts. So while he might have sold the Eiffel Tower and defrauded the government, Victor Lustig couldn't accomplish the feat of cheating on the woman you're cheating with. So in New York City on May 10th, 1935, Victor Lustig was finally arrested. He was sent to the Federal Detention Center in Manhattan. But the con man wasn't out of cons just yet. While in prison, he used his bed sheets to make a rope, cut through the bars in his cell's window, and climbed down the outside wall. Apparently he even took a rag out of his pocket and began wiping the windows so people nearby would think he was a window cleaner. Because there's nothing suspicious about a man using bed sheets to dangle out of a prison cell while hastily cleaning the windows with a dirty rag. At this point, I'm starting to think that Lustig wasn't even a good con man, it was just significantly easier to scam people because of all the lead poisoning. Still, he managed to stay on the run for nearly a month. He was finally tracked down in Pittsburgh, perhaps on his way to apologize to his mistress for not being loyal. Upon being found, he led the FBI on a car chase through the streets of the city, before the cops finally crashed into him. And that was when the Count finally gave up. As the cops opened the door, he said, "Well, boys, here I am," as if he was already planning the movie that will one day be written about him. This time, the federal authorities had no interest in letting him escape again, so they sent him to Alcatraz. Here he is on his way to the island, looking as sneaky as humanly possible. Over the next 10 years, Lustig remained in Alcatraz. During that time, the guards often suspected he was trying to plan another elaborate escape, supposedly finding more torn bedsheets in his cell. He also filed a whopping 1,192 medical requests over the years, collecting 507 prescriptions. The prison doctors said that Lustig was magnifying his ailments and complaining about fake illnesses. But it turns out he might have actually just been sick, because he died of pneumonia in March of 1947 after being transferred to a medical facility in Missouri. You know you've scammed too many people when even the doctor treating you thinks he's being scammed. But maybe Victor Lustig's greatest scam was the one we never knew about. Perhaps all those years of making medical requests were simply a slow build to being transferred out of Alcatraz, where he skillfully acted the part of a dead man, before using his charisma to talk his way out of the coroner's office, never to be seen again as the Count slipped into the night one final time. Or maybe he just died. Who's to say? Now please consider subscribing, or I'll put an ad for Pontiac on the front of your house.